So today let's talk about a very fast cinema lens for micro four thirds and other crop sensor cameras. So the lens in question is the 7 Artisans Vision Series 25mm T1.05. So since this is a fast cinema lens, I thought it would be fun to recreate some movie scenes with my Panasonic GH3. And since I'm doing it with my Panasonic GH3, I thought it would also be fun to recreate some scenes from movies that were made in 2013, which is the same year that the GH3 came out. So some specs on this 7 Artisans lens. This is a cinema lens, part of their Vision series. So this isn't like the cheaper 7 Artisans lenses that you can get from mirrorless cameras. This one is gonna run you about $550. So again, this isn't a super cheap lens, but when compared to a lot more high-end cinema lenses that are this fast, it's actually pretty affordable. The version I have is obviously for micro four thirds, but they do make this lens for a bunch of other mirrorless mounts. And as far as like sensor sizes that you can use this lens on, it goes only up to APS-C. So you won't be using this lens on like a full frame camera. So I should preface this by saying that although 7 Artisans did send me this lens in for the purpose of this video, they're not paying me or telling me that I have to say anything nice about it. And these are gonna be my honest and unbiased opinions. So I went back to Film Grab and I found a couple of movies that were made in 2013. Now the first one was actually the movie Her, which is by a director named Spike Jonze. So I decided to recreate a scene from this movie. I went down to my basement and I set up a little scene using some supplies from the dollar store, and I kind of just bounced a light off of a white wall and then it reflected back into some diffusion, which made it look like a window. And then I just tried to replicate the red in the background as best I could. And this is what I came up with. So for the next movie scene that I wanted to recreate, I found a screen grab from the movie Enemy, and this was also made in 2013. And these are types of shots that are really easy to recreate because all you really need is a window and some diffusion, and you can create some really nice looking shots. So for this one, I did shoot at T1.4 just to give myself a little deeper of depth of field. And honestly, I think that doing scene recreations like this is a really good way to practice cinematography, not only your lighting and your composition, but also your color grading. Just trying to match different types of grades in different movies, I think is a really good practice. So yeah, I'm very pleased with the results that I got with this 7 Artisans 25mm T1.05, and this is a cinema lens, so I wanted to try to use it in some cinematic situations. So I did want to talk about some of the pros and the cons of this lens. I'll touch on the pros towards the end of this video, but right now let's just focus on the cons. So there's 3 really big cons that I find with this 7 Artisans 25mm, and the first one is that it is huge. This is a big lens and it's also very heavy. Now that's to be expected with cinema glass. They're typically a lot bigger and beefier. The front filter size of this lens is 82mm, so if you have standardized everything to 77mm like I have, you are going to have to either invest in a larger variable ND filter or try to step it down. So this lens does come in different mounts for different cameras, and depending on what camera you have, you might not care about the size so much, but for me, shooting on micro four thirds, it definitely is kind of disproportionate. It's very front heavy on micro four thirds cameras, so just keep that in mind. So con number 2 is flares and ghosting at the widest aperture. So when you're shooting at T1.05, if you have any kind of light coming into the lens, you will experience some ghosting, so that's just something that you really need to keep in mind. You'll see kind of like this green or purple orb kind of just show up in a lot of your footage, so that's pretty typical with a lot of super fast lenses. And if you have any light hitting your lens really harshly, then you can experience some flares as well, which is really going to cut down the contrast. The contrast of this lens is a lot lower the wider of an aperture that you have. So con number 3 isn't really that much of a con, but you are going to experience a little bit of a softer image when you're shooting wide open on this lens, which is pretty typical again with super fast lenses like this. The thing that you have to realize though is that actual sharpness and perceived sharpness is kind of different. So if you zoom in on this lens at t1.05, it's not going to be super sharp. But if your subject is, you know, close enough to the lens and everything behind it is completely blurred out, even though it's not super sharp, the perceived sharpness is going to be actually pretty good because everything is super, super blurry in the background. You can see that on the shot of my face. It's not actually super sharp, but it looks decently sharp because everything else in this frame is blurry. So that's something that is kind of cool, that even though it's not the sharpest at t1.05, the perceived sharpness is still pretty good just because of how fast this lens is. So what's my overall conclusion on this lens? Well, I think that there is a lot of pros for this 7 Artisans 25mm, and one of the biggest ones is just how fast it is. If you're trying to shoot more cinematic stuff and you want a more shallow depth of field, t.105 is going to be more than fast enough for anything that you need to shoot on a micro four thirds sensor. I also think that the sharpness of this lens is really good, even at t.105. Obviously, it's not going to be as sharp as something like T2, but I think this is a very high quality lens. Especially if you're shooting on a higher resolution camera, you're going to be totally pleased with the sharpness of this lens. Keep in mind, I've shot this entire video on a 10-year-old Panasonic GH3, so if it can look good on this camera, it can most likely look good on whatever camera you're shooting on. So speaking of the GH3, I've compiled everything that I've learned about this camera over the past 10 years of using it and put it into a PDF guide, which is available on my website. The link to that will be in the description below. Thirdly, I just think that the build quality is just so good on this 7 Artisans lens. And the nice thing is that 7 Artisans makes a bunch of other cinema lenses that all have the same type of build quality. So if you wanted to build out a really nice cinema lens set, you can do it with these 7 Artisans lenses. And the thing that I think is nice is that even though at the widest apertures they're not going to be as sharp, there definitely is some like vintage character to these lenses when you shoot them wide open, which I think a lot of filmmakers would like. So overall, I really like this lens, and I think that if you're looking for a fast cinema lens that's built like a tank and designed for APS-C or micro four thirds sensors, you really can't go wrong with this 7 Artisans 25mm. A big thanks again to 7 Artisans for sending this out to me to review. It was super fun, and I'll leave a link to where you can find more of their lenses in the description below. And here's a really quick tip on how to rack focus manually. All you have to do is basically just